that this was from the killer. Now, the theory is that after the Dear Boss letter, which claimed credit for the murders, in other words, I'm Jack the Ripper, I'm the killer sent along a sample only he could send, and that was part of a victim. And he never called himself Jack the Ripper. He wanted credit for his kills.
Wow, so they have ripperologists.
Yes, they have individuals who have studied the case for years and years, and some of them are very good. And they have published books, I think, every 3 or 4 or 5 years. Some of these folks have done research into the investigation of the background of the victims, a lot of investigations into the background of the suspects. The photographs have been very good. They brought forward. Even some original documents have been refound and brought back to the file, so they've done a good job there. A lot of the Ripper files are now published, and you can purchase a book that gives you all the files from the entire case, at least most of them. And you can get encyclopedic books that A through Z will tell you a little bit about each aspect of the case. They're out there. And a lot of these guys will do podcasts, they'll do reports and movies and such. So there's a lot of people looking at the case. There's a great deal of interest in the Jack the Ripper murder still.
Mike, would you consider yourself a ripperologist?
No. No. I'm a crime writer who has an interest in this case. It's an historic murder case. But as a ripperologist, no. I'm just someone who is very interested in any case, and especially when it hasn't been solved yet. But I do believe we will be focusing on the actual killer. I'm hoping Scotland Yard will too pretty soon.
Yeah, me as well. Was there a pause in the murders? If there was a pause, what do you believe happened?
Well, the theory is that the killer was possibly injured when he cut up the Mitre Square victim. That was Catherine Eddowes. It was very dark in the square, and he needed to recover from a knife wound. Possibly moved out of the massive area, resituated, with so many actively looking for him, could also have been looking for work. This was a pause for a few weeks. There really is no other point in a Ripper murder where a part of the clothing was taken as a trophy. His trophy was body parts, and of course the 2 rings of Annie Chapman, but never a piece of clothing. So my theory is that he cut off that piece to hold it in his hand because he probably cut himself. He can't be walking around with a cut hand and doing murders. So I think he took the time, the pause, if you will, to recover from damaging himself. Now, another thing was going on. October 13th through 18th was the Great Search. This was a 6-day search in October 13th to 18th, 1888. And this was put together by Police Commissioner Charles Warren. And he wrote a letter to the Home Office basically asking them to cover his butt because having a massive search without warrants of just about every building in the Whitechapel area, every closet, every broom closet, every drawer, looking for any knife they could. And this is how he put it, quote, I am quite prepared to take the responsibility of adopting the most dramatic or arbitrary measures the Secretary of State can name, which would further the securing of the murderer, he continued. However, illegal they may be, provided Her Majesty's government will support me. Well, at this point, the government's running out of ideas. They needed to end this. But after the search, Warren thanked the people of the East End. It's kind of interesting that they supported it. He put this in the newspaper, quote, with few exceptions, inhabitants of all classes and creeds have freely fallen in with the proposal and have materially assisted the officers engaged in carrying it out. Now, they didn't find anything, but it did calm the area down because here the police were doing absolutely everything they could. They were putting out rewards, many extra officers, many more patrols. So even if you're an individual in the east end of London, you're partially criminal, maybe you have a job every once in a while, but you're still a criminal doing a little bit here and there, they had to respect the fact that the police were doing absolutely everything they could to catch this guy. Problem was, they weren't going to be successful.
Wow. Okay. So I hate to ask this question.
Yes, sir.
But I think people really want to know, Michael. What was the most brutal murder?
Well, that would be Mary Jane Kelly. She's one of the youngest victims there. She's a 25-year-old prostitute, and it's November the 9th, 1888. The killer, according to my theory, has recovered. He's ready to go again. This time, he's not going to be on the street because there are so many people out there looking for him. Vigilance Committee, average citizens, police patrol, double and triple patrols. Well, she lived in, believe it or not, the George Yard dwellings, which has, of course, come up a short time before. She now lived at 13 Miller's Court, right in the center of the Ripper area, down the street from George Yard, in a small courtyard yard room just off Dorset Street. Now, Dorset Street is about a block and a half from Flower and Dean Street. That evening, November 8th, she's drinking at her favorite pub, the Britannica. This is on Dorset Street, the east end of Dorset Street. At 2 a.m. on the 9th, she meets a man near, once again, Flower and Dean Street. She takes her to her room. Now, she's seen by another prostitute, and she's also seen by a man named George Hutchinson. Now, Hutchinson hears her say to her client, "All right, my dear, come along, you will be comfortable." Now, Hutchinson is thought to have been, he never really proved it, but thought to be one of her customers, one of her regulars. He's waiting outside her room to be maybe next man in line. He waits about an hour till about 3 a.m. and he leaves. By that time, she's probably already dead. In fact, more than likely, considering the condition of the body and what was going on, she was probably dead by then. So you have to understand that it's a very small room. It's a back courtyard of Dorset Street. Jack the Ripper is essentially trapped inside that room with a witness outside. He described the man as heavy mustache, curled up, dark eyes, bushy eyebrows, and dressed well. And again, if you take a look at a photograph of Severino Kozlowski, that's description is pretty much hand to glove. So he walks away. There was a cry of murder earlier on. Nobody said anything. Nobody went and investigated. You had heard cries of murder a lot in the East End of London. You can put your nickel down on that one. But at 10:30 in the morning, 10:45 rather in the morning, Thomas Bauer, he works for the gentleman who owns the building, goes out seeking rent money. She's about 6 weeks behind on her rent, so it's time to, get some ducats from her. He opens the door, can't get in, or tries to open the door, can't get in, finds the body through the window. Well, she's been brutally murdered in her room, throat cut, parts cut off from several areas. Her face was pretty much destroyed. You would not be able to identify her. In fact, her boyfriend, one of her boyfriends, said could not identify her only by the hair. So her face was pretty much chopped up. Now, the only part missing was her heart was removed and taken away. So this was, to answer your question, the most brutal murder in this series, in the Ripper series.
Okay, wow, took her heart.
Yes, he did.
Whoa, I understand the murder, that's kind of still resonating in my head.
Yes.
So, but I understand a murder pardon was issued. Is this true?
Yes, it was. This was basically a last-ditch effort by the British government. The British authorities issued what was called a Queen's Pardon. Now, this was issued for any accomplice. It was written up by Police Commissioner Charles Warren, and we have a copy here, and I'll read it for you. It's very interesting. It states, murder pardon. Whereas, on November the 8th or 9th, in Miller's Court, Dorset Street, Spitalfields, Mary Jeanette Kelly was murdered by some person or persons unknown. The Secretary of State will advise the grant of Her Majesty's gracious pardon to any accomplice not being a person who contrived or actually committed the murder, who shall give information and evidence as shall lead to the discovery and conviction of the person or persons who committed the murder. Signed, Charles Warren. The only problem with that is that this killer worked alone. So it was a nice shot. It was a, Hail Mary, if you will. Mm-hmm. But as far as they could tell, he lived alone. He worked alone. Did not have accomplice. And the proof of the pudding was that it did not stop the murders.
So basically, they were giving anybody who knew about it or helped participate immunity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But now if you take a look at the key point here, mm-hmm. they're giving them immunity in the Mary Kelly murders.
Okay.
So you've got 2 or 3 earlier ones.
That they can still charge.
Absolutely.
So sort of like
a partial Queen's Pardon.
Like cheese to catch a rat.
Essentially, yeah. So you're looking at the possibility of, okay, we won't hang you for the Mary Kelly murder. We'll hang you from the ones before.
Wow. Okay. So they must have thought the intelligence of anybody who would help Jack the Ripper was kind of they must have thought they weren't that smart. They didn't know the law because.
Well, it's a possibility, but I don't think they necessarily published the murder part all at once. Just stated that there was a murder part.
Okay.
So now they could have read it in court later on, but that's a little late if you're the guy who's turned yourself in.
And really, who would work with Jack the Ripper?
Well, there are murder teams out there.
True.
Burke and Hare, one of the books I wrote. I mean, you're talking about 1828 Edinburgh, Scotland. These guys were serial killers, grave robbers, and everything else.
Wow. Okay, let me see. The authorities discounted later murders by the Ripper. Some writers agree. What do you think?
That is a possible open question. And to be honest with you, it's never really going to be answered. After the Kelly murder, I can tell you why there was confusion. Official London had to play down the murders. The cops were getting well out of hand. People were extremely agitated. They'd done everything they possibly could. So they were beginning to attribute any further murders to persons, or believe it or not, other causes other than murder. So they were putting out information in general directions to reporters, to investigators, to general people who were maybe well known in the area of Whitechapel, agitators really. They were reporting that the Ripper was in an asylum or drowned in the Thames. That's Montague John Druitt. Or committed suicide, or even left the area. Now that's where the confusion began, and it cannot be totally discounted. But they were doing absolutely everything they could to try to tell people, okay, this guy is not killing anymore. We may not have found him, but if you're smart enough, if you're thinking, if Scotland Yard's telling you, well, he either was this, or he was that, or he's the other thing, they don't know anything. So, if they said he's in an asylum, they could say, okay, this is the guy, here's his name, he's in an asylum. Other than being, well, maybe he left, maybe he drowned. So it wasn't exactly a very good ploy.
Wow, so you brought up a good point, which I forget, even equating it to modern times, like to try to solve a serial killer crime or murder spree, it's gonna cost some money. It's gonna cost some tax money.
Oh, a tremendous amount of tax money. They had quadrupled the amount of people patrolling, just the constables themselves. And you got to remember, this is only 1 square mile of London. London's pretty big. Mm-hmm. You're pulling people from all over London who are now have less police protection, less investigators. You have 20 or 30 inspectors on one case. You have 200 or 300 constables that are added to these things. You've got vigilance committees. You're paying all this extra money, all this time at headquarters, keeping track of these things. You've got secretaries. You've got people keeping track of the files, writing them down, making notes. So this was a tremendous cost. And it was talked about in Parliament. So, yeah, they were in a rock and a hard place here. And he was still killing.
Wow, that's incredible. That's incredible. Even to equate it to modern times.
Sure.
Like the Summer of Sam.
Son of Sam, sure.
Yeah, Son of Sam.
Sure.
Yeah, that cost New York City a lot of money and a lot of man time and hours and manpower.
Sure, absolutely.
Wow, so serial killers, they really do put a dent in sort of what's going on, and so as far as police enforcement,
yes, indeed,
tax money.
Yes, indeed. Well, look at the Yorkshire Ripper. They spent years trying to find that guy before they finally found him. So it gets very costly.
And then you also lose the public's confidence in the sort of police establishment. Wow, it goes deep. Like a serial killer can really affect an area deeply.
It does, and it still affects the area because to this day there are Ripper tours. To this day, you've got the case is still open. They never closed the case in Scotland Yard, and this is arguably the most infamous serial killer case or infamous murder case in Scotland Yard's history. So the question is, where is that young Scotland Yard inspector who wants to make the criminal discovery of his life? He might still be there. Wow.
With technology today, maybe we might actually find this young detective.
I'll have a few things to say about that a little later, but yes, okay. We'll definitely get into that. Yes.
So, what later murders could the Ripper have committed in London?
Well, there's only 3 that come under the possibility of being Ripper murders, and the first one came only a month later after the Mary Kelly murder, and this was Rose Milette. Now, this is a very unique, interesting murder case. Rose Milette, 26 years old. It's December the 20th, 1888. We're still in the Autumn of Terror, or close enough. Her nickname was Drunk Lizzie Davis. So you kind of give an idea of the kind of individual we're dealing with. Now, she lived on George Street, right by George Yard, around the corner from Flower and Dean Street. Again, the center of the Ripper murder areas. That's where she lived. But she was murdered 2 miles east from the central Whitechapel area in Poplar High Street, Poplor, Poplar High Street. Now, what's interesting about the area is that just before Severino Kozlowski came to Whitechapel, his first residence, his first barbershop job was in Poplar East End, around the corner from where Rose Milette was found dead. And this is 2 miles away. So you've got an area where he lived in 1887, 2 miles away, and the Ripper victim is from the same general area where he's living right now. She was murdered and found 4:15 a.m., December 20th, by a constable named Robert Golding. Now, the body was still warm. We're talking about December the 20th, so it's pretty cold out there. This is London, England, and cold and wet and damp. Body's still warm, so he must have surprised the killer. Now, she was strangled, but no knife wounds. Now, Dr. Matthew Brownfield reported, quote, death was due to strangulation. A lot of people don't realize in the Ripper case that there's a lot of suspicion that the victims were strangled first. So this would fit into the Ripper methodology. Strangle them first, then cut the throat. 5 other doctors, it's critical here, also reported death by strangulation. The coroner's jury ruled, quote, willful murder by person or persons unknown. Now, here's the problem. Official London put no more investigators on this case. It was case closed. Assistant Commissioner Dr. Robert Anderson refused to go any further, calling it accidental death. She fell on her collar, choked to death. Well, the bottom line is this case found its way to the Ripper file, so they knew it was a Ripper murder. So this was the first Ripper murder, and that's why it's controversial. The first Ripper murder that is not officially recognized at the time as being a Ripper murder. So now they're covering up the crimes of Jack the Ripper, essentially. There's one reason why he got away with it, too, as a matter of fact, because there was no knife wounds on the throat.
Okay.
So Scotland Yard and official London could say this is not a Ripper murder. If she had her throat cut, that would be a little difficult.
So the Ripper murders have just become politicized.
Absolutely.
There you go.
Absolutely. Official London is going to do everything they can to remove these from the Ripper's file. So again, that's why you'll have ripperologists and other people who are interested in the case say, well, there was only 4, there were only 5, there were only 6 murders. Well, maybe there were 9. So you've got a little leeway there. But, 1 is too many. So, but the next one occurred a long time after that. It was July 16, 17, 1889. Again, a prostitute. By the way, Rose Milette was a prostitute as well. He's still sticking to his target audience, if you will. Alice Mackenzie, 39 years old. Again, July 16, 17, 1889. Now, at 11:40 p.m., Mackenzie is seen walking down Flower and Dean Street. This street comes up all the time. She passed the barber shop on Flower and Dean Street. Now, we know she was in a hurry because several prostitutes were there at the stoop in front of the barber shop and across the street at their lodging houses. And she says, all right, I can't stop now. So the thought is she's about ready to meet somebody. She's a working prostitute going to meet a man.